Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening. All right, joining me on the Postcards from a Dying World podcast is author Adrian Walker, beaming to us straight from the United Kingdom. Adrian, you are the author of two books that I was a big fan of, End of the World Running Club and The Human Sun, which are the two that we're probably going to focus on because those are the ones that I read and wrote very detailed reviews of. But you've written several books. How did you get into storytelling? And have you, obviously you're a musician. There's a clue there in the room. But how did writing come into your world?
Well, first, hi. Thanks for having me on the podcast. It's really great. I actually listened to a couple of your podcasts, the Paul Tremblay one this morning.
Oh, awesome! Yeah, he was a great interview. That book is really good timing too.
So yeah, thanks very much. And how did I get into storytelling? It's something I often ask myself because I think that the kind of the ideal answer to that question is usually I have a passion for story, or I've always told stories, I have to write. And I don't think I ever really did. I always happened to have written most of my when I was a kid, and it just always was something I did. But it actually took me a long time, relatively speaking, to get to the point where I could actually write a coherent story. What would come out as you might consider a story that made sense. I had various different attempts through my 20s, trying to write some sort of literary thriller. I tried sci-fi, but it wasn't until sort of mid-30s, I would say, when I actually had the gumption to sit down and finish a book. And I think part of the reason for that was that writers tend to come into writing at different times. You get a lot of prodigious writers like Zadie Smith, I'm thinking of particularly, who wrote White Teeth, a British author, when she was 21. If I'd written anything at 21, it would have been ridiculous. I had nothing to write about at 21. I had to live a bit before I actually had some ideas. So I would say 30 plus, and certainly when I had kids as well, that's when I really started to sit down. I think my kids, being a parent, is a theme which actually runs through a lot of my books, just because it's a fairly intense, emotionally and physically experience. So that comes out quite a lot. I also tell my kids lots of stories, so that helps.
Right, and we'll dig into that when we get to the nitty gritty of the stuff. But would you say that End of the World Running Club was the book that was kind of like your storytelling breakthrough, like where you felt like you came into your own as a storyteller, or was there something before that?
There was one before that called From the Storm, and that was I sometimes think, with a lot of writers, myself included, you need to get that first book out, because it's a hard process. You learn a lot in that first book. I don't think it necessarily should be published either, that first book, because it's probably not your best work. But I did put a lot of time into that book. But yeah, definitely the End of the World Running Club was where I found my voice, and things started to happen after that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that first book, was it one that you published, or was End of the World Running Club the first one that you published?
No, From the Storm, I self-published. That was the one I sent off to various agents. I had all the envelopes, or I got the Writers and Artists yearbook, sent it all off to the right people. I think I got one response. That wasn't just sending my manuscript back. It was a single post-it that said, "Too wordy for a thriller." That was it. No, no name, nothing, not even a hello, just too wordy for a thriller. So I kind of, it's a difficult process for every writer, that trying to get an agent, trying to get a publisher, and getting the rejections back. So
you have to have thick skin, and you have to believe in what you're doing.
Oh yeah.
to go through that process. And those of the writers who stick with it are generally the ones who really believe in their stories. So, you know, but anyway, so but End of the World Running Club had two lives as well. But so that first one, did you self-publish that one? And where did that go? Because I admit I haven't read it, so I don't know that one. you know.
Which what the end of the world running club book?
No, End of the World Running Club I read, but the one before it, your first one, was it from the story you said it was? I'm sorry, I'm being a bad researcher.
Not many people have heard of that book. That was just like the first one. That really that came out right at the beginning of the kind of self-publishing boom.
Mhm.
So there was still a lot of interest in people just downloading things on their Kindle. They were getting free books, and it was a quite useful time to start in that industry, I guess.
Mhm.
Really, for me, it was a good way of getting feedback, and seeing that actually there were people out there that would read my work, that actually genuinely liked it, and that gave me enough confidence to self-publish the End of the World Running Club.
Right, but it also got picked up later. What was the process of the two lives of End of the World Running Club? How did it
Well,
get to
we
a
were
second life?
we were actually living in Texas at the time. My wife, we were expats over in Houston,
Mhm.
uh, and we just found out that we were being moved back to the UK. We were supposed to be there for 4 years. We'd been there for a year, I think. We just got settled. The kids were starting schools, but we were just being moved back. So I was very much aware of the fact that I was going to have to go back to work, find some job in my previous career as a software developer. And I didn't really want to do that. So we were kind of looking through the various. I remember we were at a Mexican restaurant, and we were just talking through the various sort of ideas that we were going to do. My phone bleeped, and it was an email from Penguin, Penguin Random House, and they were saying, "We picked up your book, we love it, would we like to talk about a contract?" So they actually contacted me. I've done everything back to front, basically.
Right.
The idea is you get an agent and then a publisher. I ended up publishing, then getting a publisher, and then getting an agent. So, so not the ideal way of doing it, but yeah, from that moment on, yeah, that was a fairly big year. Actually getting into the traditional publishing industry and meeting people, and yeah, experiencing all of that.
So, did you, between the draft or the version that was self-published and the version that Penguin went out, did you go through another round of edits and another draft? Okay. And and I'm sure you probably feel like it's a significantly. I only read the Penguin version, so I don't know the differences in the two. But to me, that's a really interesting idea: is that you have two versions of this book
Mhm.
floating around. How different were they?
In content, I mean, the whole narrative arc almost identical. I think we dropped about 10,000 words. So
Mm-hmm.
potentially some scenes in there that really weren't that important. Um, linking up the various points at which they stop. But the biggest change was to increase or sort of amplify Beth's voice. So that's Ed's wife's voice, and give her a bit more of a part, which was very important because I was actually going to go on to write the sequel from her point of view, The End of the World Survivors Club. So yeah, it didn't change that much. I think it just became a lot tighter. It was a lot of tightening around the edges.
Well, and I gotta say, obviously, I'm one of the people that discovered your book because Stephen King tweeted about it. And for me, my immediate reaction was I read the tweet, and while I was still on my phone, I clicked over to my library app. Oh, wait, there's the book. And and I read it within like a week. And it's not that I'm the biggest Stephen King fan, even, but I trust when he talks about a book. And the next thing was I wasn't entirely sold, but when I saw that Robert McCammon had blurbed it, and he is one of my all-time favorite writers. And considering there was, that those two wrote Swan Song and The Stand, which are two of the best apocalyptic epics of all time, I was immediately sold. And one of the things that I've told people about this book is that it is on the level of Swan Song and The Stand, and I don't say that lightly. That I think is one of the best end of the world epics. Where did the idea for End of the World Running Club come from? And we should say, for anyone who's listening without spoilers, that this story is about someone who has to basically, they have no other way to cross the United Kingdom to get rescued in the end of the world. And the only way to journey 500 miles, 550 miles is to run because the roads are destroyed and everything. Great concept. Where did this come from?
It's when I think back, it's really interesting how that idea developed, because I think at the time I wrote it, I was a new father, so I had two young kids, like infants. I was getting into running, and the running was actually helping me a lot with the various stresses and strains you go through as a new parent, lack of sleep. And at the same time, for some reason, I was obsessed with the end of the world. I'm not sure why that was happening. I tend to get obsessed by ideas, and that's what I tend to write about, the ideas I'm obsessed about. So at that time, I was a new father, getting into running, end of the world. The initial idea I had was actually to write about a runner who was already a good runner. He was a fit young man, and he was going to be with a group of other fit young men running across the country and being heroes. And as I was writing that, I realized there's nothing interesting about that story at all. It's literally just it's a fantasy story more than anything. So I just made the very simple decision to try and mirror the story of what it's like to start running. When you start as a runner, and try and mimic that whole process of the pain of starting running and the wanting to give up and not wanting to continue, to actually getting to the point where you realize it's getting good for you. And if that is mirrored in the book quite as you follow Ed's journey. But as for the rest of it, it was really just long nights thinking about end of the world scenarios. Initially, it was going to be a nuclear holocaust, but there was far too much to think about with regards to radiation and all that kind of stuff. So much easier just to pelt the sky, pelt the earth with asteroids.
Right. And what's really interesting is that I recommended this book to a lot of people early in the pandemic because I found there was a lot of us who were not able to work out in gyms like we were used to. I was a runner before the pandemic, but I increased the amount of running and my endurance when all of a sudden I couldn't go to the gym anymore. And I knew a couple other people that were going through this. And because, I do book reviews and I do this blog and this podcast, I get asked for book recommendations all the time, and especially early in the pandemic. So this was one of my go-to recommendations early in this pandemic was I said, I kept telling people this is a good one for those of you who are getting into running right now, because you can kind of feel like you're going on a journey with the characters. Now, it's interesting that you talk about the character because Edgar Hill, your main character in End of the World Running Club, it was a wise choice as a writer to make him not a runner, that he has to learn this. In fact, it's 200 pages into the book before he actually starts running. So, and I think that that's important because you're doing a great job of laying out the disaster and the reasons why he has absolutely no choice. It's kind of like a haunted house book where you have to have the reason why they would stay in the house, right? You can't write a haunted house novel until you have a reason why. Why don't they just leave, right? You got to do that. So you had to do, why does he have to run? Why would he do that?
Yeah.
And I like that you're saying you didn't want to make him a hero, because I got to say, Edgar Hill's not winning Father of the Year awards at the beginning of this book. So talk about making him as a character, because I would imagine, since you said you had young kids, were you trying to kind of express your fears of what you don't want to be as a father at that point?
That's a very good way of saying it. Yeah, because I think a lot of people have asked me and said, "Are you Edgar Hill? Is that you just writing from your own perspective?" And
Mhm.
not really at all. But I did have that fear, I suppose, that you could end up letting your failures getting the better of you when you put into a situation like parenthood. I don't know. Have you got kids? Are you?
No, I'm not a well, I don't want to make it sound insulting, but I'm not a breeder. My wife and I are both people that didn't want to have kids, so I lucked out on that. For me, I like to be an uncle.
It's a much safer way of being, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's hard. I think people have different experiences, but it does challenge you mentally, and it challenges you physically as well. Certainly in the early years, you become quite. The lack of sleep can change you.
Mhm.
Gives you strange mental experiences. So yeah, there was a bit of fear there, I suppose. But I suppose I'd read a lot as well, and I talked to other fathers about how they were dealing with it. And I guess Edgar Hill is a lumping of all the negatives um, that can be in a father or a parent, even. Um, Not a reflection, hopefully, of myself as a father. But yeah.
And we're gonna get deeper into that with Human Son, because that is especially coming from my position. That was one of the reasons why I had, I think, a unique experience with the book of the Human Son. But continuing on with End of the World Running Club, because I definitely want people to understand. I want to sell people on this book because I thought it was great. Um, the thing about you hit a lot of the tropes of the genre because you have to. That's part of it. It's also part of the fun, right? If I'm reading a book like The Stand or Swan Song, I want to see how authors translate and work with these tropes. Because I think that kind of sounds insulting, but it's not. What I'm saying is, and since you got guitars behind you, Rudy Rudker, the surrealist sci-fi author, he always says there's certain power chords in genre storytelling that you have to be good at. And
Technology, yeah.
yeah, and so I think, talk about like hitting those notes, those power chords in End of the World Running Club. There were certain things you had to do if you're tackling the end of the world, right? And but you had this fresh spin on it, that somebody's running across the landscape, right?
Exactly. I think actually, I don't know if I was aware at the time that I was writing tropes or that there were bits that were tropey, if you like.
Yeah.
Um, One thing I was very much aware of was that all of the apocalyptic films and books that I'd read tended to have their apocalypse, that the spectacle of the apocalypse, which is a trope in itself, what does the world look like after it's destroyed, tended to be centered in cities. So you'd see a lot of, I went through so many different wallpapers on my computer screen of artistic renderings of Manchester and London after apocalyptic event. I loved all that, the artistry of it, and floods and what have you, but very little of what the countryside would look like if it had been devastated. Um, and I brought up in England and Scotland, and I love the countryside of where I'm from. So I did spend quite a long time thinking about how that would look if hillsides were blown away and gigantic craters appeared where cities had been before. But in terms of the more traditional tropes, I think there's a part when they get to a stately home,
Mhm.
and there's an old dude living there, an old lord. I think that could probably be considered a trope. I think that happens in 28 Days Later. They stay in a big stately home, don't they? I think most of the tropes you see, then you get to the opposite to that, which is the council estate in Manchester, and that's been overrun by a fairly insidious force. I think most of those tropes are really just very stark contrasts between what was before and what was now.
Mhm.
That's what people like to see in post-apocalyptic films. They like to see things that were so important and so integral to their lives, or so familiar to their lives, just taken away. Because I think a lot of people like that genre because it takes away all of the complication from life, takes away all of the dust that gets into our life, and it gives you a level playing field. It's that leveling, I think, that people like. Um,
Mhm.
I
Well,
think in
a
terms
trick
of
I a trick I used in my novel, The Ring of Fire, which is kind of end of the world sci-fi thing, but I didn't hide it, right? I put it out there in the open as an Easter egg where I named a character Robbins because I kept telling one of my friends, "Oh, he's like Tim Robbins in War of the Worlds." He's the character that they when they get a lull and he explains everything that's happening to him.
yes,
And then I just said, "Well, I'll pay homage to it instead of trying to hide it, right?" And and that to me is playing a power chord. It's like, I'm gonna do what works, and I'm gonna do that. Now, one of the things about Into the World Running Club that's so brilliant about the concept is that what drives the suspense of the book is that not only do you have the run and the setting, but there's the ticking clock. So you have three different things that drive narrative suspense
mhm,
just baked in to the ingredients of the cake before you even put it in the oven, right? But when I now personally, I'm a religious outliner, and I know that there are certain writers like Stephen King who's religious about pantsing and like writing from the seat of his pants. I couldn't imagine writing this book without an outline because you have those three things to juggle. But I don't know. Are you an outliner or did you write this book by the seat of your pants? I'm very interested.
I'm actually trying to think about that because the first book, From the Storm, no outline,
Hmm.
really was just riffing, and I found that very hard.
Hmm.
World Running Club, I knew the last um, the last line
Right.
before I started writing, um, so I knew, but the general story. In terms of outline, at that point, I definitely had points I wanted to hit. It's actually quite easy. It's a lot easier on that kind of book because you're following a journey. So it is literally you're on a map. Where are they going? What happens in this point? What happens in this point? And you can map out all the character arcs in that sense as well. So
Did
I
you use the
definitely
map? Did you look at the map while you were writing? Yeah, I would imagine you would. Okay, yeah.
so I
That had to help. Yeah.
yeah, and you can you put the time, the chronology as well on that as well.
Mhm.
Uh, but it's certainly nowhere near as outlined as I outline the human sun, for example. I do outline everything now. I do feel I've gone a bit too far with outlining, and the book I'm currently writing, I'm easing back a bit, um, just because it can constrain me. I feel if I have to get through a certain few scenes without being able to explore other things, that can get a bit claustrophobic. So I tend to sketch out the night before what I'm going to write, and before any big sort of, I don't know, 20, 30,000 words, I'll do a storyboard of what's likely to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I always tell people that um, outlines are a map, but the difference between like a map that's objective, your map as an outline is subjective. And if you start to learn about the story, you can always go back to the outline and redo it. I have a tendency that if I break down my books into three act structures, at the end of each act, I go back and I redo the outline based on what I learned about the characters. And I feel like that's the best way to go. And then I've also found, even as religious as I am about outlines, when I get to the last 5, 6 chapters of the book, I don't even look at it anymore. That's when I stop looking. But I also feel like outlines are more important for us writers who have day jobs, who are not living by it, because yeah, it's great when Stephen King says that outlines are soulless, but um, he's speaking from privilege that he doesn't have his kids are grown, he doesn't have a job to go to, he doesn't sometimes you might not get back to the book for a couple days, and that outline can be a godsend to sit down and say, okay, where am I? What am I doing?
I'm gonna write, yeah, get that.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because and the next question I had was what other tricks did you use writing this book? And it's obviously you used the map, right? And that's great because for End of the World Running Club, it's just perfect to have that map. And I'm sure your map had notes all over it. You said with the time, were you writing the times and the dates of where he was for all the runs?
The points they had to hit, and actually trying to work out whether it's possible to run, whether it was possible for someone that had never really run before to run that distance,
Hmm.
and what points they'd actually hit. So yeah,
Wow. Yeah,
I
that's
also,
really cool.
I
You
remember
held on to that map, right? So you held on to that map, right? So you could look at it.
it somewhere.
Yeah, that's great. No, I really appreciate that book. It was I know it was one of my top reads of the year that year. And it's one that stuck with me. It's one of those books that I got at the library and then went back and bought my own copy because I know at some point I was going to look at it again, which was for this. Um, but it's just one of those books that really won me over. And so, for example, when The Human Son came out, your new book, it's one of those things where as soon as I saw the library had it, I was like, okay, that's it. I'm going to read it. And because I'm a big library user, read as much as I do without it. But Human Son is your, am I wrong? Is this your first real attempt at science fiction? Like, seriously, I know you could consider an apocalypse end of the world novel is science fiction, and I'm all for, as we talked about earlier, expanding the scope of it. So I understand that that's science fiction, but like really like centuries in the future, speculative fiction. Have you written short science fiction, or is this the first like real big attempt at it?
Definitely. I mean, again, I don't think when I started it, I was aware I was writing science fiction, um, which is perhaps a bit short-sighted given, you're right, it's set 500 years in the future, and it's a race of superhuman beings. So yeah, totally, it has to be science fiction. But yes, all the other books are what you might call dystopian or speculative. Um, this would definitely fall back into the science fiction camp.
And one of the things about The Human Son is I think it is both utopia and dystopia, depending upon how you look at it. And we'll get into that. I feel like a bad interviewer because I did not ask about your influences and the writers that you came up reading, because now I'm interested in what kind of science fiction you've read. But before that, I want to take a guess
Well,
just because, but two authors who I really saw in your work and End of the World Running Club specifically, and I could be wrong, but I see a lot of Richard Matheson and Robert McCammon to stay in the M's. I know McCammon blurbed your book, but I wonder if their influences because they're very specifically two authors that I thought of a lot. Matheson because of the suspense beats, the ability to tie the emotional weight of the moments to the suspense. Nobody does that better than Richard Matheson. And so I saw that there. And then McCammon for being able to make the epic scope personal. But I could be
hey,
wrong. Who are your influences?
I haven't read either of those authors. I'm sorry, but I will do now on your advice.
Okay. Well, yeah, definitely Richard Matheson. You should know everyone should read I Am Legend because even though it's been made into a bunch of bad movies, the book is
Thank
unfuckwithable. But
you.
who are your influences then?
My influences, I don't know, music and writing, any kind of art. I tend to become obsessed with one thing.
Mhm.
I am fairly eclectic with what I like, but I tend to gravitate to something and I just want to listen to that or read that or watch it for a while, and then I move on to the next thing. But in terms of writers, I grew up with Stephen King.
Mhm.
Uh, I grew up with Douglas Adams. Um, Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was the first book I read that made me laugh out loud from a single sentence. And that always sticks with me. I remember where I was, and when it happened, I just thought, wow, a stream of words that someone else wrote just made me laugh out loud. For, you know, I thought that was quite an incredible power. As I grew up, I tended to get more into. Well, I went through a fair amount of apocalyptic fiction. Lucifer's Hammer was a big book that's always stuck with me. But really, one of my favorite writers is Glenn Duncan. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No, I haven't.
The Last Werewolf trilogy.
Okay, I will look into. I make recommendations. So, Glenn Duncan, you say?
Glenn Duncan, yeah, and he's one of these. The reason I liked him was because he spans what you might call a genre and literary fiction, whatever literary is. So there's as much attention paid to the writing as there is to the tropes, you might say, or the story of werewolves in this case. He wrote a brilliant book called I, Lucifer, which is one of my favorite books. And that's about basically Lucifer taking the body of a writer for a month and telling his side of the story. So those kind of books really turned me on. I got into Zadie Smith as well, Sebastian Faulks. So yeah, I'm all over the place really with influences. I couldn't tell you what really influenced the End of the World Running Club apart from what was in my head at that point. So yeah.
Now, Human Son is also an end of the world story as well, but just a very different one. We're gonna try to stay without spoilers for a little bit, but we are gonna get really heavily into the writing of the book, and I'll give a spoiler warning for listeners. At this point, the thing about this book is, it is part utopia and part dystopia at the same time. And it's a very thoughtful political book that thinks about. It's impossible to think about this novel without taking massive swings at the nature of humanity, parenthood, the existence of the species itself. But it seems that the very concept of having a child and parenthood is at the center of this story. Where did the germ of this story come from? Because it's such a heavy topic. And I don't want to make it sound like it's not entertaining. It is entertaining, but it's just there's lots of levels to this thing. So where did it come from?
I think again it was 2 or 3 ideas that converged. Same with Running Club. Let me see. My wife is a very, very intelligent woman. She's a climate change scientist, an atmospheric chemist, like Ema in the book. And she spends most of her days understanding the dynamics of climate change and where everything's going. So I have a fairly good advisor in terms of how our planet is going. So for the last few years, I've been aware of certain things that are pretty heavy. So obviously that was something that was pretty high on my agenda of what I wanted to write about was the way things were going planetary. But I didn't want to write a preachy, we're all doomed, we're all terrible people kind of book. I suppose I wanted to examine why we had got to that point. Why have we got to this point as a species where we're letting this happen? And again, I didn't want that answer. I didn't feel that answer was that we were bad as a species. I felt that there was a parallel there between the guidance that a parent gives a child and the guidance that perhaps we're lacking as a species, because we've been given this incredible brain, we've this ability to procreate and organize ourselves and create technology, but without any kind of guidance, unless you are of religious bent, in which case you consider God your guidance. I personally don't. So for me, that was the big sort of idea is what would have happened, I guess, if we did have guidance. What if we could create something that was more intelligent than us, that was able to see through the noise that is in front of us every day of our lives, was able to see clearly about what had to happen to fix the problems on the planet. And again, what would happen if that guidance could also be turned back into parenthood? So those were the ideas I was playing with at the start, I guess. Initially, my first idea was that it was going to be robots, looking after a human child, and it was going to be a quirky kind of comedy in that sense. But the more I thought about it, the more it really started to drill down into the experience of a single parent, a person looking after a child, and all of the questions that come from that.
Well, and a lot of times with authors, when they're working on a book, sometimes it comes down to making the one single choice, changing two characters from romantic interests to siblings, or for example, and in this case, the decision to make them genetically engineered species, of kind of ultra humans as opposed to um, robots, as we joke on the Dickheads podcast, I think was a really incredibly wise choice and wise decision for you to move this story, because I think the emotional core of the parenthood, challenge is so much a part of this story. So yes, very, very important decision. And it's something we talk about on this podcast all the time, and I want other writers to think about, is sometimes reframing. Sometimes you can take the same dialogue, the same thing, and just move it to a different location. It's really important. But this little decision of changing from robots to another form of genetically engineered life just really made this book work in a really great way. So I got to just hats off to you on that. But the next question I have is, every parent thinks their child is the most important in the world, right? But the human son kind of it balances these issues of the massive scope of climate change, with drilling down into parenthood. And so I would imagine you kind of already answered this a little bit, but that push and pull between, like, my kid is the most important versus like the overall mission of it's the Aretas, is that how it's pronounced? Yeah, their overall mission versus the mission of raising this one child. Like talk. I mean, you obviously were outlining this, so this you had to be thinking about that push and pull the whole time, right?
And much of this was based on my own experiences. I mean, my wife and I have a fairly balanced approach to parenting. Um, for the first few years of my kid's life, she was the primary breadwinner, and I was, looking after the kids at home. So we've swapped about our roles quite a lot. So I'm very much aware of what it's like, certainly in those early days as a parent, and how isolated you can get as a parent. And how, like you say, your world becomes absorbed by this thing.
Right.
Everything else just seems less important, but to everyone else, your important thing is not very important at all. So that's one of the narratives that runs through the book, is that the Earth have this higher purpose that they're working towards, the transcendence. Their need to leave the planet and become this higher intelligence. Whereas Ema really is just trying to look after this, trying to survive day by day, looking after this child, and she becomes quite isolated in that sense. So yeah, that was a big theme going through. Not sure what else to say about that one.
Well, it seems like there's the yin and yang of parenting, where there's the ultimate highs and the really good moments, and the moments that are the struggle. I think is something that the reader could probably relate to in this story. Um, and I think I don't know. I mean, I think I can feel like the parent at home, even though you're not a single parent, but you got kind of the experiences. Your wife's away at work, and that comes through in this book. I think it really does. Do you ever joke with your kids about the role that they played in inspiring this book, or?
Actually, I wrote it for. It's dedicated to my son. He gave me quite a lot of inspiration. A lot of the things he's done, and certainly a lot of the events in that book are based on actual real happenings. Without being a, I don't want to. Are we okay with spoilers or not?
We'll be getting to spoilers in a bit, so we can come back to that.
There's a scene sort of midway through, I think, when he's about 7 or 8, and he has a moment of enlightenment in the forest. You know, he basically says, what is this? What am I? What how is all this stuff here? How am I here? What is life? You know, what is existence? You know, this sudden kind of jarring realization that this is weird, you know. And my son did that. You know, I was walking with him and he just stopped and just went, what's going on?
Right.
It was like a real existential sort of moment. So yeah, I joke with him quite a lot about that. And there's some other ones from when they were babies, obviously, that you know, you get earlier in the book as well, mostly involving feces and vomit.
Right. Now I do come to this. I kind of ruined this in the narrative of our interview, but I come at this book in kind of a weird way. Is that since the Human Son is about parenthood and environmentalism, as a person, like environmental issues and climate change are very important to me. I'm a longtime environmental activist. I wrote a sci-fi novel myself, Ring of Fire. So it's a topic that um, I'm very engaged with, but just me personally, and this is not a judgment, it's not on anyone else, but you know, my wife and I made the decision not just for environmental reasons, but just because we didn't feel like we would be the best parents. um, but on top of that, we environmental issues were some of the concerns that we thought about when we made the decision when we weren't going to have children, that wasn't a path that we were going to take. And it's interesting to me because I feel like where this book really celebrates parenthood, it also, part of the core of this book is kind of questioning the should we be here, should we not aspect of it. I wonder, like, how you, I mean, you had to know this was happening as you were writing the book, even if it was intentional or unintentional. You had to know that these issues were coming up. How did you feel about that as you were writing this book? Like that those issues that different people would read it different ways on that way.
I was very much aware of that, and there's two sides to that really. The first is, like you say, that question of, do we really deserve to be here? Do we really, given what we've done in the last 200 years, should we not really be thinking of giving up and you know, sacrificing ourselves? But I didn't want that to be the main thrust of it, because I also feel underneath of that, there's certainly in the last 20, 30 years, we have become very critical of ourselves. You know, it's very easy to say, we're terrible. Look at us. Look at what we do. You know, we see it all the time. The videos on the news and you know, documentaries we see. It's very hard not to feel bad as a human these days. But really, when you look at the decisions that have led to where we are now, very few of those decisions have been cynical, aggressive decisions. They're mostly the decisions of people just trying to live their lives. And I suppose part of what I wanted to explore is we kind of have a right to be here doing whatever we're doing. We probably have a lot to learn in how we're doing that, and we really do have to prevent the pollution. We have to prevent climate change from getting any worse. But beating ourselves up over it isn't going to help. You know, we need to understand why we got to that place in the first place, why we've made those decisions, why we live so much in the present without thinking of the future, which is, you know, a fairly big part of being human. So that I wanted that to be another question that you ask as you go along. Are we really right to think so ill of ourselves? Could we have done it any other way, really?
Right. And one thing that's cool is, and I read them a month apart, but Human Son also kind of tracks well with Kim Stanley Robinson's recent ministry for the future, because but what I liked about both of your sci-fi books coming at this time is they're both books that focus on solutions and see a way for the Earth to kind of come out of this in a better way. Um, uh, what I liked about Human Son is that it was a way weirder solution where Ken Stanley Robinson's trying to have a very scientifically accurate one. Um, I had more fun with yours, uh, but I like that it's not. And look, I'm a person that can dwell on the doom of it all day. Cli-fi is one of my favorite genres. There's a reason I wrote in it. You know, and really, there's a British tradition of this going back to John Brunner in 1969 winning the Hugo for Stand on Zanzibar. So you know, there's a long tradition of environmental sci-fi coming from your island, and you know, good stuff too. You know, it's great to see something that has like a positive outcome for the human species. So okay, so before we get into spoilers, I want to go to spoilers and the actual like nitty gritty of writing the book, and we'll get into actual quotes and things from it. Just a final pitch for the Human Son, and you know, like how do you pitch this if you're if parties still existed, um, where you know someone says like, oh, what's your new book about? Like, how do you explain Human Son to them?
Um, it's not as quick as the Underworld Running Club, which is basically the title.
Yeah.
Uh, the Human Son is set 500 years in the future. It is about a genetically engineered race of humans who have solved climate change by removing humans from the situation.
Mhm.
And they now have to decide whether to bring humans back or whether to leave them out of the equation. And in doing this, they elect to create one human who is looked after by a particularly clinically minded member of their species. And it's really about her story, her journey as a parent as he grows from birth to adulthood.
Mhm.
And it's also a love letter to the human race, I'd say that as well.
Awesome. All right, so we're gonna get into spoilers. And by the way, I just did read a book, Mockingbird by Walter Tevis, the guy who wrote Queen's Gambit, one of his science fiction novels. Where when we get into spoilers, he did kind of write the robot version
Oh,
of this story to a degree. It's a little bit different of a story, but I think you'd really appreciate Mockingbird and see that you're playing with a lot of the same toys. Um, and it's funny because I read those books. Uh, I read Mockingbird like 2 books after I read Human Son, and I was like, wow, these books really go are like peanut butter and jelly. All right, so for listeners, we're going to go into spoilers now. We're going to get really deep into the writing and the construction of this. We're going to get nitty gritty about process and things like that. So if you haven't read the book, pause the podcast, go read the book, come back. Um, if you don't worry about being spoiled and just want to hear like some good writing advice, you can stick around too, because Adrian wrote a hell of a book, and I want to get into how he did it. Um, so first off, let's talk about the Areta and their motivation and where they came from. I have this quote where one of the Areta characters says, "I've spent my life planning transcendence, 5 centuries planning our escape from this rock. We don't belong here. I'm not in this place of beasts or hurricanes, but they do. This is where they thrive in the dark places." So um, it's going to be really hard to write about this species without turning them into stock villains or turning them into these things. But I like that you made them very neutral. Like that had to require some. Did you think out their Reta separate from the narrative first? Did you spend a lot of time thinking about them outside of the narrative? Like, I have to know who this species are before I even start the narrative. That's what I was wondering.
yeah, I definitely did. And actually, my publishers helped me with that because they almost demanded a document detailing who the Erta were. So I had to write bit of a world building document to define exactly what they look like, how they behaved, and one of the key features of them is not what they can do, which is fairly impressive. You know, that they're very strong and they're super intelligent. They're basically quantum computers on legs.
Mhm.
But not just what they can do, but what has been taken away from them in terms of their genetic code. So they have none of the fear, none of the distraction, none of the play, I suppose, that humans have, which in the book they certainly see as facets which have held humans back. So without all of that noise in front of them, they're able to see very clearly what has to happen. They're also a species that require a purpose. They need to know what their purpose is, and their purpose was very clear. They were designed to fix the planet from climate change by hook or by crook. So yes, I spent a long time thinking about how they would behave with each other. A lot of time I spent with actually how they communicated. And there's 3 methods of their communication. You ever watch Cats together?
No, no. Oh, you mean the animal, not the
Yeah.
movie? Yeah. Yes, I've had cats around a lot. Yeah.
Um, but they sometimes appear to communicate just by looking at each other. You know, they kind of walk around each other, and there's almost an interplay of words there that isn't there. So that was one of the ways that the Urta communicate, because their brains are so aligned.
Mhm.
They can predict what the other person is going to say before they say it. So in the early days of the Urta, that's how they communicated silently. They just knew what was going to happen, what the other person was going to think or say. And it was only later on that they started to develop different methods of speech. So language and speech and communication was a fairly heavy part of the process. And certainly because it's written first person by one of these beings, I had to reflect that in her tone. So she is very, you might consider, fairly clinical and undescriptive to start with. And she actually uses no similes at all for the first, I would say, third to half of the book, purely because she doesn't understand what similes are. What's the point in saying what something's like when you can say what it is? You know, that's their idea. The idea that you have to describe a sun like something that hangs like an orange just doesn't make sense to her. So that was a very freeing experience to write without simile or metaphor. Literally, you're just stating facts and writing out, you know, how things are, but also quite challenging because at the same time I had to make it interesting.
And we'll get nitty gritty on the pros too, because I do have questions about that, because there's some really interesting things going on there. But keeping with Areta, it's interesting because one of the things that you had to build up to in this book was that as their purpose dwindles and changes, and transcendence becomes their new purpose, and as um, on Irma or Ima, sorry, as Ima becomes a parent and her purpose becomes raising this child, they change, just like humans change becoming parents, and humans change when their purposes change, and um, the new pressures change how they behave. But you had to make that consistent. But you also had to, you know, when Ima makes a decision that no, I don't want to transcend, I'm going to stay here for my child, that changes everything. And then that turns into, for the first time, this species like considering violence and these things. So I mean, that had to have been very challenging to write, as far as like knowing how to progress that and knowing, how you were doing those things. How much did you think about that progression in their behavior?
Um, I think that was one of the things I hadn't outlined, was that progression.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I knew basically the book starts off and you are given a narrative of how things have gone. You know, what has happened with humanity and in the past, and where they are, why they are where they are now. And that's certainly the narrative that Ema starts the book with. That's what she believes. But yeah, spoiler alert, isn't quite what happened, as she finds out much later in the book. So I guess I had to find a way of understanding what the different levels of the Urta. There's a kind of hierarchy to their society, in terms of their responsibilities, and what those different levels have brought out. So one of the big narrative arcs is the fact that, like you say, as soon as their purpose is fulfilled, they start to become a little bit more like humans. They start to dwindle back into the old ways of violence and disagreement, and the reasons for that become quite clear later in the book.
Well, we're in spoilers. We're assuming that everyone's read the book at this point, so you can
So,
boil
uh,
away.
so we believe that humans have died out peacefully,
Mhm.
but actually, thanks to the decisions of probably quite a few of the Urta, a relative few of the Urta, it's not that peaceful at all. They're destroyed, not because they fought back, but because they just wouldn't move out of the way of some trucks. Basically, they staged a protest. They had a very peaceful, very large camp around one of the facilities where they're generating a virus, and the Urta decide that the only way forwards is to destroy them. And yeah, they lose their lives quite a lot. This is something that Ema finds out much later in the book, and it's as much a surprise to her as anyone else. So the reason, what I found as I was doing that, was there was a parallel there between what you tell kids is
Mhm.
the reality, and actually what they find out as the reality as they grow up. We lie to our children fairly nicely. We tell them things exist that don't exist. We tell them things are the way they are because of certain things, but we don't tell them the truth. They find that out from themselves, and that's something that is, in Ema's case and Reed's case, the child is fairly big. He finds out he's not an Urta after all, and he's the only human left on the planet. So, and she finds out that her species have behaved in a certain way when she thought it was a different way. So that
Yeah,
idea.
and I picked out that scene actually as one that I wanted to talk about, which is in where he says to Ema, he says, well, what about underground or high in the mountains, space? They had rockets maybe on a different planet. And then she says it's not possible. And then he says, it must be, I can't be alone. And one of the most powerful moments in the book is that, all she can say is sorry. She can't give him, she can't tell him anything else. She can't tell him it's gonna be all right, maybe somewhere. But no, she knows they're gone. He's it. That's it. It's a very heartbreaking moment in the book, and big
Yeah,
thumbs up for that.
something that every parent has to do eventually. You have to stop lying. You have to stop sugarcoating the world and tell them the truth. But I think there's a moment, might be in that scene, or maybe later, where he challenges her again about that.
Mm.
And he says, well, how do you know there's nothing out there? And she says, because that's what I was told. And he says, well, you were lied to as well. So who knows what the truth is? So it doubles back on itself a bit there.
Because no matter how much you try to tell your kids the truth, sometimes they still don't want to take it. uh, yeah, I know that happens, and there's times sometimes when they're right, maybe, but you know, that there's the yin and the yang of parenting that is such a backbone of this book. All right, so now let's talk about the technical level and the prose, because the prose on this book is something that um, I think you're doing your job right. Most readers, it's just going to go right over them. But being that I'm a writer and I geek out on this stuff, I notice these things. And on a technical level, the prose here is very tricky. And you already mentioned that in the beginning you weren't doing similes and you were doing very matter of the fact. But this book also not only is written mostly in first person, but it switches from time to time to second person, where Emma's speaking directly to her son and to Reed, and she's really writing this book for Reed. It's not for us. It's for Reed. So that presents like really tricky moments, because at the same time, this whole book is, and oh, I just got it. I just got it, Adrian. I just figured out one of the aspects of this book, because you just said it. This book is both, um I'm explaining the hard truths to her son, but Adrian explaining the hard truths to our species to a certain degree. I know you said you didn't want to be preachy, and I don't think that it is preachy, but I think you're expressing yourself. It's political science fiction. I like it. Um, I mean, John Brunner is my favorite science fiction writer, and he was as preachy as it gets. Um, so I'm fine with that. But I see that you're communicating, you're writing obviously for a reader, but at the same time you're having to write through Ima's eyes to read. So balancing that on a technical level must have just been really, 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 really tricky. Um, did you have was a second draft where did you have to iron a lot of that out on a second draft,
No, this book is probably to date the easiest book I've written. Um, and that is down to the fact that I knew what Ema sounded like. I knew her voice right from the outset. I knew exactly what she was like, what she looked like, how she behaved, how she carried herself, and how she spoke. So writing was really just a case of giving that voice, the time it needed. I can't really explain it any other way than that. There was no the only thing, like I say, I really tried to concentrate on was the fact that she would not use simile for the first part of the book. It's only when she starts to understand humanity and read and the value of comparison and the value of trying to say what things are like rather than what they are, that she starts to use that. But in terms of like you say, the nitty gritty of the prose, that's really just ventriloquism. It's really just hearing voices that I've heard through my life. In my head, she was very, very British. She's very almost like Galadriel in a Jane Austen novel. That's how I imagined her sometimes. That kind of powerful voice. But actually, the audiobook that came out in June is done by a brilliant actor called Alison O'Donnell, a Scottish actor, and she asked me, what voice do you want Ema to be? And I said, well, I wrote it in this kind of Southern English way, and she said, I don't think I could keep that up for that length of time. It's going to have to be Scottish. So she's done her in the Scottish accent. It's brilliant to hear, and the sound of her doing Ema now is what I imagine Ema to be. But audiobooks are actually really, really good ways of hearing back your prose and certainly the dialogue. It's a good way of listening and seeing if you've done the right job. There were certainly a few times when I was listening to the audiobook where I thought that sentence went on a bit too long, because I could hear her sort of gasping for breath at the end to try and get to the next one. That's always a good indication that maybe you've used too many words.
Yeah, I imagine. Well, okay, so we've kind of already got an idea of what the mission statement of this book was, but when I every time I review a book now, starting this year, I've started trying to look for mission statements that in a book, and I know not every book has one, but I kind of try to look for something that I feel expresses that. And certainly, I saw it in the scene where where they're arguing about the human species, and Reed says, I've seen what they've done, all the fighting, and then Ima says, all the fighting you mean? Anyways, that's not all the only thing that they did. That's not the only thing that they did, and I feel like um, a huge part of the mission statement of this book is that, is what you said earlier, like, we have a right to be here, we have the right to do this. And what's interesting for me is for me, as somebody who really loved this book and really thought it was a beautiful book, and it got if I'd read it before the end of the year, it would have been it would have really been high on my best of the year list, which is saying something, because God, I loved The Only Good Indian last year. And I thought to myself, I'm not sure if The Human Son would have beat it out. and then I was like just glad I didn't have to think about it because I read it in 2021, which is a little inside baseball. But anyways, as far as the mission statement goes, and I know I'm rambling a little bit, but what's really interesting for me as somebody who really loved this book is um, I had a hard time with that. I had a hard time with that mission statement because I'm a little bit of a misanthrope, and I admit this.
Me too. Me too.
And it was really interesting because one of the things that I think is great about this book is it challenged me. It challenged me as a misanthrope. And I actually, and this line, like when I read it, I had the thought of, I was literally holding the book and I thought to myself, well, I'm not sure I agree with that, but I really like how it was delivered. And
With that.
I'm interested to know how you feel about that because I don't know if you thought that was the mission statement of the book, but it was so interesting to me to find a mission statement of the book that I loved and not sure that I
Agree with it.
right?
I don't think books really should have a mission statement, or maybe that's wrong with. I'm very aware of something called armature. Do you know Brian McDonald?
No, I'm not familiar. No.
He's a, I think he's a screen artist. He's just sorry, a screenplay writer, but he also is brought in by Hollywood to fix scripts. So he's a script fixer, and he's written a book called Invisible Ink, which is really good, really good. I go back to it constantly. It's really short, but it's got so much good advice about story, and how stories work. And one of the key things he talks about is this thing called armature, which I think is what you're trying. The same thing as a mission statement in your words, and it's really what drives the whole book. What not just the theme or the character or the narrative. It's what central idea drives every single scene of every single book. What do you take out of it? And I think that is certainly one of those. What you said, the idea that we're entitled to be here and we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much. There's another one in there which I don't know where it comes in, but it's stated out loud in the book, which is that things have to get worse before they get better sometimes. And I think that's just as strong. But like I say, I don't think these armatures or mission statements should be messages that you want to force down people's throats. They should be questions that you get people to ask themselves. So I'm really chuffed that you have asked yourself that question because of reading the book. That's really all you can really hope for. And yes, I completely understand why you would think otherwise, because I'm fairly misanthropic as well when it comes to humanity. I suppose when I wrote this, it was 2016, 17 when I started to write it. So this is when things were happening in America. We had Brexit in the UK. Things were changing quite a lot, and people were really hard on themselves and really coming down on us as a species. And when you have social media that amplifies that, so much, it really sort of stuck with me, this idea that why do we alone consider ourselves, this one species on the planet, as being so awful? No other species on the planet questions itself the way we do. Fair enough, no other species on the planet creates coal-fired power stations, but I mean, it's this kind of relentless gnashing of teeth we have about ourselves, I think, is probably going to get in our way if we really want to fix our problems. So yeah, that's where that mission statement came from. But I can understand why you would think differently.
Well, I like a book that challenges me, and I like a book that makes me think, and that's one of the things it did. So, and this question may seem like one we should have talked about before spoilers, but I do think that it is kind of a spoiler to answer this question, and that is, and I did mention this before, but do you feel the human son is a utopia or a dystopia? Because or is it both? Because I think it kind of exists in both spaces, and I think that that's kind of one of the neat things about the book is that it exists in both spaces. But do you come down on it being one or the other?
I would veer towards the utopian, purely because I do think our future potentially lies in the help of artificial intelligence or a different intelligence. I do think that our success as a species is going to rely on that fairly heavily. So in terms of that, yes, that's a utopian ideal for me. Obviously, in terms of the entire human race being wiped out, not very utopian, but the idea that we could regrow from that is pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I want to thank you for writing science fiction and for gracing the genre with this work, because I think that's great. Did you get any pushback from your publishers for doing, because the marketing people like to put everybody into a box and say, well, that's going to be confusing because you're going to have one book on one shelf and one on the other, or or did they just get the idea right away that like that
Oh,
this?
I did. In fact, this book was supposed to be my third book for Penguin,
Mhm.
uh, Penguin Random House, and I wrote it and sent it to them. And I had quite a dark week where I got the initial response back, which was, yeah, really great, but we can't publish it in the way it is. We need to change it and have all these different changes to the narrative and make it more about Reed and have his point of view. And this is something I always say to writers. You should listen to gatekeepers. You should listen to editors and agents when they say these things, because they know what they're talking about. But there is also a line. If what they're asking you to do is not in your heart of hearts what you want that story to be, you are also entitled to say no. So I made the decision to say I'm not doing that. And we decided together that that book wouldn't be with Penguin. So I took it to my agent. Luckily, my agent championed it, and we found Rebellion, who are part of Solaris, and they're a hardcore sci-fi fantasy outfit, and they loved it as it was, and didn't want to change much about it at all. So yeah, I did get kickback, but not from the publishers that actually published it.
They actually did it. Okay. Yeah. I guess I hadn't noticed that it was a different publisher in my head, which I should have noticed that. But you're a writer who now, when I see your name on a book, I don't look at I just say, okay, I'm gonna read that.
Every writer wants to hear.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think the skill with which End of the World Running Club knocked my socks off. I'm there for it. And here's the thing: Human Son is a really deeply thoughtful and beautiful piece of science fiction, and it does what science fiction does at its best, which is use today as writes a book about today using the lens of tomorrow, and it's the kind of thing that we need more of in science fiction. We need more challenging science fiction, and I hope that some of the writers that made it this far in the interview will learn from you and do emotionally challenging science fiction. So, on that note, um, last lastly, is you said this was your easiest book to write, but there had to be challenges in the narrative that you weren't expecting, and every writer has that. But I'm wondering if you could tell us about something that a spur of the moment solution that you came up during the writing process that might be good for other writers to learn about that happened on Human Son.
So, I can think of one particular point, and actually my agent helped me with this. So again, spoilers, but very near the end, there comes a time where there's a standoff between the Sundra, who are a kind of splinter group of the Earth who prefer to stay on the Earth and are much more, environmental, you might say, or much more human, and the High Council of the Earth. And it's worth saying at this point, there is no violence in ocean society. They don't hit each other. There's no war. It just doesn't make sense to them. But there is this scene where they have this standoff. And interestingly, we were talking about tropes earlier. I found myself at this point falling into, I remember writing it thinking, okay, I'm getting very tropey here. This is now a battle. This is a battle scene between two tribes. one higher, one more earthy. So I just let myself get carried along with this trope. And as I was writing it, I remember feeling I wasn't happy about the way it was going. People were dying all over the place. There was smoke. Everything was just like out of any fantasy film you've seen where there's a battle. And my agent picked up and he said, "This doesn't seem right." And part of the problem was that there's a moment when someone throws the first punch, and no one's shocked by it. They just go all in and they start having a fight. And I remember my agent Sam said, "What about if you just have him punch one single punch, and then everything's
And everybody just loses their shit, right?"
And then they realize they've crossed a line. That's a line that they've crossed as a species that we have crossed many thousands of years before. And they back away from
around the world.
Yeah, and the whole scene just backs down. There is obviously violence later, which you don't see, but that was a point at which, like you say, you have to just think of things in a slightly different way, and helps having someone that's read the book to help you along with that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's when you get the right editors and collaborators to help you along, it's really important to have people with an outside eye sometimes, point you in the right direction. Adrian, this was awesome. I really love Human Son and can't wait to see what you got next. Do you have anything that's close to finishing that we can look forward to, or?
I'm about 2/3 through my next book. I'm not in contract at the moment, so this is all speculative. It'll be going to my agent, I'll be going out to pitch it, but it's a haunted house book. Interesting houses earlier, so I'm taking that piece of advice.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because that one piece, it's that one thing that's the essential to the haunted house. One of my favorite examples of that recently is a couple years ago, I read Lisa Morton's The Castle of Los Angeles, and hers is about a haunted playhouse. And of course, the woman, like, all of her money is tied into the playhouse. She can't leave. She can't give up on the playhouse because if she does, she'll be homeless. And, all of her reputation is gone. And it's always that one thing, right? You got to have that one thing. Well, I'm really looking forward to see what you do with that genre. Much like Paul Tremblay, when I was talking to him and I said, which genre defining trope are you going to do in an amazing new way next? And I look forward to that as well. But yeah, and I can't believe you've never read Robert McCammon. Reading End of the World Running Club, I can't believe you've never read Swan Song. You got to read Swan Song.
Reading writer, I'm just terrible. Yeah, I'll look it up.
That's the only one I'm just gonna put my foot down and say, Adrian, the author of End of the World Running Club, and I know he's blurbed on your book. He's blurbed your book. That Swan Song is right up your End of the World alley. I guarantee. I would almost bet a toe that you will love that book. As
you know, I'll stick it on my Kindle and I'll let you know we get on.
Yeah, and I wrote down Invisible Ink because that sounded really like one that I get a lot out of too. So, Adrian, thank you for joining us on Postcards from a Dying World. I'm sure the listeners got a lot out of this, and I hope to have you back when we have a haunted house book to talk about. So,
thanks very much for having me on.